The rope that held the rope hung against the cliff face like a question mark. 60 feet of manila hemp that had already lowered 12 wounded men to safety and now waited for the 13th. Desmond Doss crouched at the edge of Hacksaw Ridge, his hands raw from handling the rough fibers, watching the afternoon sun filter through smoke that refused to clear. Below, stretcher-bearers moved like ants across the muddy ground where the 77th Infantry Division had established its aid station. Above, the plateau stretched behind him in cratered silence, broken only by distant Japanese voices echoing from hidden cave positions. The rope had been rigged that morning during the failed assault, anchored around the concrete foundation of a destroyed bunker and threaded through improvised pulleys made from rifle slings. It was crude engineering, the kind of desperate solution that emerged when proper equipment was shattered by mortars and men had to choose between innovation and abandonment. Now it represented the only path to safety for wounded soldiers, too broken to walk, too heavy for evacuation, through the tree line where machine gun nests still commanded the approaches to Hacksaw Ridge. Doss tested the anchor point again, running his fingers along the rope where it wrapped around the bunker foundation. The manila hemp showed strain, individual fibers beginning to separate under repeated stress, the weave loosening where it bore the weight of wounded men lowered through darkness and intermittent shell fire. Each evacuation stressed the rope further, yet it held, somehow it held, carrying one more broken body toward the aid station below. Private Johnson lay beside the rope harness, conscious but pale, shrapnel wounds in his legs, making every movement agony. He would be the 13th man lowered from the ridge, following 12 others who had been evacuated one by one through the afternoon and evening. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. The rope could probably handle a dozen more evacuations before critical failure. 23 wounded men remained scattered across the plateau behind them. "Doc, you sure about this rope?" Johnson whispered, his voice barely audible over distant artillery. "Looks like it's seen better days." "It's held this long," Doss replied, checking the harness straps one more time. "Just got to trust it to hold once more." But privately, he wondered the same thing. The rope had been salvaged from supply bundles dropped earlier in the week, never intended for repeated human evacuations under combat conditions. Each time he lowered a wounded soldier into the darkness below, he listened for the sound of fibers snapping, watched for sudden slack that would mean catastrophic failure. Yet somehow the manila hemp continued to bear weight, continued to offer hope to men who had none left on their own. Lieutenant Morrison approached through the smoke, moving carefully between shell craters and scattered equipment. His uniform was torn at the shoulder, his helmet dented from shrapnel, but his voice remained steady despite 3 days of continuous contact with Japanese forces entrenched throughout the ridge system. The 77th Infantry Division had taken Hacksaw Ridge twice, lost it once, and now held the plateau through sheer, stubborn determination and the knowledge that retreat meant abandoning wounded soldiers who couldn't move on their own. "Doss, we've got word from battalion. Full withdrawal at 2100 hours. That gives us maybe 2 more hours of light, then another hour in darkness. You need to get everyone down who's going down." Doss looked across the plateau where wounded men lay in whatever cover they could find. Shell craters, collapsed bunkers, the twisted remains of trees shattered by repeated bombardment. 23 soldiers, some conscious and alert, others barely breathing, all depending on one fraying rope and the determination of a medic who carried no weapon but refused to leave the ridge without them. 23 men, Lieutenant, even working fast. That's cutting it close. "I know the count," Morrison replied, "but those are the orders. Japanese are massing for a night attack. We can't hold this position past 2100. The rope swayed slightly in the evening breeze, a gentle motion that seemed almost peaceful against the harsh reality of combat on Okinawa. Doss had been handling that rope for 6 hours now. His palms burned raw from the manila fibers, his shoulders aching from the repetitive motion of lowering wounded soldiers over the cliff edge. But each successful evacuation proved the system worked, proved that desperate improvisation could overcome impossible circumstances. Johnson grimaced as they fitted the harness around his waist and legs, the straps pressing against shrapnel wounds that would require surgery once he reached the aid station below. He was a rifleman from 2nd Platoon, 20 years old, from Ohio, with a girlfriend named Sarah who sent letters that smelled like lavender. Small details that mattered when you were lowering a man into darkness on a rope that might snap at any moment. "See you at the bottom, Doc," Johnson said, as Doss guided him over the cliff edge. The evacuation process had become routine through repetition. Check the harness, test the rope tension, lower slowly while monitoring for sudden jerks or signs of failure. 20 feet down, 40 feet, 50 feet, until Johnson's weight disappeared and voices called up from below that he was safe. 13 successful evacuations. The rope held. But as Doss coiled the line for the next wounded soldier, he noticed new fraying near the anchor point, individual strands beginning to separate where the rope bore the greatest stress. 23 men remained on the plateau. The rope might last for 20 more evacuations, or it might snap on the very next one. In the growing darkness of Hacksaw Ridge, with Japanese forces preparing for night assault and American orders demanding full withdrawal, everything depended on 60 feet of manila hemp that had already exceeded its design limits. Everything depended on faith, in engineering, in improvisation, in the stubborn belief that one more wounded soldier could be saved if you were willing to trust your life to a fraying rope. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The second rope had been Private Martinez's idea, suggested in a moment of desperate clarity as he lay bleeding from stomach wounds near the cliff edge. "Doc, what if the main line snaps? You got a backup?" It was a question that haunted Doss as he worked through the afternoon, watching the primary rope show increasing signs of stress while 23 wounded soldiers waited for evacuation from Hacksaw Ridge. The 77th Infantry Division's assault on the ridge had been planned for 3 days, postponed twice due to weather, then launched at dawn in conditions that turned the coral stones slippery and treacherous. Japanese defenders had used the delays well, repositioning machine guns in cave mouths, pre-sighting mortars on likely approach routes, turning the plateau into an interlocking field of fire that caught American forces in the open with nowhere to retreat except back over the cliff edge they had climbed at such cost. Now, as evening shadows lengthened across the shattered landscape, Doss rigged a secondary line using rope salvaged from supply bundles and equipment harnesses. It was thinner than the primary rope, probably rated for less weight, but it offered insurance against catastrophic failure when everything depended on getting wounded men off the plateau before the ordered withdrawal at 2100 hours. Sergeant Collins watched him work, adjusting knots and testing anchor points with methodical precision despite the occasional crack of sniper fire from Japanese positions across the ridge. Collins had been on Okinawa since the initial landings, had seen 3 medics killed and 2 evacuated with wounds, and had developed the kind of protective cynicism that kept soldiers functional through extended combat. But he'd never seen anything like what Doss was attempting on Hacksaw Ridge. "You know this is crazy, right, Doc?" Collins said, checking his rifle for the 100th time that day. 23 men, 2 hours of light, 1 rope that's already showing strain. Math doesn't work. "Math's got nothing to do with it," Doss replied, testing the secondary rope's anchor point. "These men didn't choose to get shot up here, can't choose to abandon them just because the numbers look bad." The truth was more complicated, though Doss rarely spoke about the calculations that ran through his mind during evacuation operations. Weight limits, rope strength, anchor point integrity, time remaining before withdrawal. He understood the mathematics of survival as well as any engineer. But understanding the numbers didn't change the reality that wounded soldiers lay scattered across the plateau. calling for help that wouldn't come if he followed orders and climbed down the rope ahead of them. Private Yamamoto was the 14th man, lowered from the ridge, unconscious from blood loss, but stabilized enough to survive the evacuation if handled carefully. He was a Japanese-American soldier from Hawaii, whose presence in the 77th Infantry Division carried its own complicated weight on Okinawa, where enemy voices echoed from hidden positions and racial identity became tangled with military necessity. As Doss lowered him into the darkness, he wondered what Yamamoto dreamed about during unconsciousness. Home, family, the irony of fighting Japanese soldiers while bearing a Japanese name. The rope held for the 14th evacuation, though Doss noticed increased stretching in the manila fibers, the kind of elongation that preceded failure in overloaded systems. He had worked construction before the war, understood materials and stress points, knew that rope typically failed gradually, then suddenly. The question was whether gradual failure would become sudden failure during evacuation number 15, or 20, or 22. Lieutenant Morrison returned with updated intelligence from battalion headquarters, moving carefully through the rubble that littered the plateau after 3 days of sustained combat. The 77th Infantry Division had taken heavy casualties throughout the ridge system, particularly among officers and non-commissioned officers who exposed themselves during assault operations. Morrison was acting company commander, promoted from platoon leader when Captain Rodriguez was evacuated with severe wounds 2 days earlier. "Doc, I've been thinking about your evacuation schedule. Maybe we should focus on the men most likely to survive. Triage. Get the walking wounded down first, then the serious cases if time permits." Doss looked across the plateau, where wounded soldiers waited in whatever cover they could find. Some were alert and responsive, others barely conscious, all depending on his medical judgment and the integrity of a rope system that grew more questionable with each evacuation. The suggestion made tactical sense. Save the men most likely to benefit from treatment, maximize survival numbers, accept losses among those too severely wounded to have realistic chances. "Can't do it that way, Lieutenant. Won't choose which men deserve to go down first based on how shot up they are. They all fought the same fight. They all earned the same chance." It was a conversation that revealed the deeper tensions on Hacksaw Ridge, the conflict between military pragmatism and moral conviction that defined Doss's approach to combat medicine. Orders demanded efficiency, evacuation priorities, rational allocation of limited resources. But faith demanded something else, the stubborn insistence that every wounded soldier deserved equal effort, regardless of injury severity or survival probability. The rope swayed in the evening breeze, as if responding to their conversation, a gentle motion that reminded everyone present how much depended on 60 feet of manila hemp and the anchor points that secured it to the ridge. Below, stretcher-bearers waited to receive the next wounded soldier. Above, Japanese positions remained ominously quiet, the kind of silence that preceded night attacks and final assaults on isolated positions. As Doss prepared the harness for evacuation number 15, he noticed Sergeant Collins checking his ammunition supply and cleaning his rifle with unusual attention to detail. It was the behavior of a soldier who expected contact, who understood that time was running short and enemy forces were preparing for action that would make further evacuations impossible. 22 wounded men remained on the plateau. The rope showed increasing signs of stress. Orders demanded withdrawal in less than 2 hours. Everything depended on faith, in hemp fibers, in anchor points, in the stubborn conviction that mathematical impossibility could be overcome through determination and prayer. The rope began singing at evacuation number 17, a high-pitched vibration that ran through the manila fibers as they stretched beyond normal operating limits. Doss felt it through his hands as he lowered Corporal Bradley toward the aid station below, a subtle harmonic tension that spoke of materials approaching failure under repeated stress. Hacksaw Ridge had become an engineering problem as much as a medical emergency, with 20 wounded soldiers depending on fiber strength calculations and anchor point integrity. The 77th Infantry Division's position on the plateau had deteriorated throughout the afternoon, as Japanese forces repositioned for what intelligence suggested would be a coordinated night attack. Radio intercepts indicated enemy units moving through tunnel systems that honeycombed the ridge, preparing to emerge from concealed positions and overwhelm American forces holding the cliff top. Battalion orders were clear: full withdrawal by 2100 hours, no exceptions, no delays for evacuation operations that might compromise the entire unit's escape. But Doss had stopped listening to battalion orders somewhere around evacuation number 12, when the mathematical impossibility of saving everyone became clear, and he decided that mathematics mattered less than the voices calling "medic" from shell craters across the plateau. He had never carried a weapon, never fired a shot in anger, but he understood combat in terms of weight-bearing calculations and stress distribution, the engineering principles that determined whether rope would hold or wounded soldiers would fall 60 feet to their deaths. Corporal Bradley reached the bottom safely, becoming the 17th successful evacuation despite the rope's increasingly alarming behavior. As Doss hauled the line back up, he examined the fibers at the anchor point where stress concentration was highest. Individual strands had begun separating, creating weak spots that would propagate under continued loading. In construction work, he would have condemned the rope and rigged a replacement. On Hacksaw Ridge, replacement rope didn't exist, and 19 wounded soldiers waited for evacuation with enemy attack imminent. Sergeant Collins approached through the rubble, his movement more cautious than earlier in the day, responding to changes in the tactical situation that made survival increasingly unlikely for anyone remaining on the plateau after dark. The 77th Infantry Division had learned hard lessons about night fighting on Okinawa, where Japanese forces excelled at infiltration tactics and close combat in the darkness. Holding Hacksaw Ridge through a coordinated night attack would be difficult even for unwounded soldiers with adequate ammunition. For a medic with 19 casualties and a failing rope, it would be impossible. "Doc, I've been monitoring radio traffic. Enemies massing for night assault, probably hitting us from 3 directions. We need to be off this ridge before they get organized." Doss nodded absently, his attention focused on examining the rope where it showed the most severe fraying. He was calculating failure probability, estimating how many more evacuations the Manila hemp could sustain before catastrophic breakdown. The mathematics were uncertain. Rope strength varied with temperature, humidity, stress history, manufacturing quality. But experience suggested he might have enough integrity for 10 more evacuations, possibly 15 if anchor points held, and he distributed load carefully. 19 men, Sergeant. Even working fast, that's cutting it close. But the rope might hold if we're careful about weight distribution and lower speeds. What he didn't say was that the rope's singing had changed pitch during Bradley's evacuation, indicating new stress patterns that suggested accelerating deterioration in fiber strength. Materials failed gradually, then suddenly, and the gradually phase was ending. But faith sometimes meant continuing when mathematics counseled retreat, trusting that determination could overcome engineering limitations. The plateau had become a landscape of contradictions. American soldiers holding ground they couldn't keep, using equipment beyond its design limits, attempting evacuations that violated every tactical principle learned in training. Yet somehow it worked. Somehow the desperate improvisation succeeded where proper procedures would have failed. 19 wounded men had been lowered to safety despite impossible circumstances. 19 more waited for their turn at the rope. Word came from the aid station below that all evacuated soldiers were receiving treatment, that the field hospital was managing the influx despite supply shortages and personnel limits. Dr. Harrison, the chief medical officer, had sent word that whatever Doss was doing on top of Hacksaw Ridge was saving lives that would otherwise be lost. It was encouragement that mattered during the moments when rope failure seemed inevitable and enemy attack appeared imminent. Private Kowalski would be evacuation number 18, conscious despite severe leg wounds, alert enough to understand the risks involved in trusting his life to a rope that vibrated with harmonic stress. He was a demolitions expert from Pennsylvania, familiar with load calculations and material strength, qualified to judge whether the evacuation system would support his weight during the 60-foot descent to safety. "Doc, that rope sounds like it's ready to let go. You sure about this?" "Sure as I can be about anything up here," Doss replied, checking the harness fittings. "But staying put isn't an option with night attack coming." The harness itself showed wear from repeated use, straps stretched and buckles loosened by the stress of 18 evacuations. Everything was failing gradually: rope, hardware, anchor points, the tactical situation, the time remaining before enemy forces attacked. But gradual failure could be managed if sudden failure was avoided, if faith overcame mathematics, if determination trumped engineering limitations. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. As Doss guided Kowalski over the cliff edge, the rope sang its high-pitched warning song, individual fibers stretching toward their breaking point while supporting weight they were never designed to carry. Below, darkness gathered around the aid station where stretcher-bearers waited to receive another wounded soldier. Above, Japanese voices grew louder in the hidden positions that commanded Hacksaw Ridge. 18 men had been saved. 18 men waited for salvation that depended on Manila hemp and faith. The rope snapped at 1847 hours, just as Private Kowalski reached the 30-foot mark in his descent from Hacksaw Ridge. Doss felt the sudden slack through his hands, that sickening moment when weight disappeared and Manila fibers parted under stress they could no longer bear. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, he thought Kowalski was falling. That evacuation number 18 had become the catastrophic failure everyone expected. Then voices called up from below that the soldier had landed safely, cushioned by his comrades' quick thinking, and the fact that 30 feet was survivable with help. But the primary rope was finished, its anchor point showing where individual strands had separated under repeated loading until critical failure became inevitable. 60 feet of Manila hemp that had saved 17 lives now hung useless against the cliff face, no longer capable of supporting human weight during evacuation operations. 18 wounded soldiers remained scattered across the plateau, with enemy attack imminent and no apparent means of getting them down alive. The secondary rope became primary by necessity rather than choice. Thinner, lighter, probably rated for less weight than the original line, it represented the only hope for continued evacuations as darkness fell across Hacksaw Ridge and Japanese forces prepared for assault. Doss examined the backup system with growing concern, testing anchor points that seemed less secure, evaluating hardware that looked increasingly inadequate for the loads it would have to bear. Lieutenant Morrison arrived with final intelligence updates from battalion headquarters, his expression reflecting the deteriorating tactical situation throughout the 77th Infantry Division's sector. Japanese forces had been observed massing in the tunnel systems that honeycombed the ridge, preparing for coordinated attacks that would emerge from multiple concealed positions simultaneously. American forces holding the plateau would face assault from unexpected directions, making defense nearly impossible and evacuation operations suicidal. "Doc, battalions moved the withdrawal time to 20-30 hours. Intelligence indicates enemy attack beginning around 2100, possibly earlier if they achieve tactical surprise. That gives you maybe 45 minutes to get everyone down." 18 wounded soldiers in 45 minutes using a secondary rope of questionable integrity, mathematics that bordered on impossible even under ideal conditions. But Hacksaw Ridge had moved beyond normal calculations hours ago, entering territory where determination mattered more than engineering specifications and faith overcame material limitations. Doss had learned to trust rope beyond its design limits, to believe that desperate improvisation could succeed where proper procedures failed. Sergeant Collins helped rig the secondary evacuation system, his movements reflecting 3 days of continuous combat and the knowledge that American forces were approaching the limits of tactical endurance. The 77th Infantry Division had taken heavy casualties throughout the ridge system, particularly among leadership personnel who exposed themselves during assault operations. Collins was the senior non-commissioned officer remaining on the plateau, responsible for coordinating whatever defense might be possible if Japanese forces attacked before evacuation was complete. "This backup rope's a lot thinner than what we've been using," Collins observed, testing the anchor point with professional skepticism. "You sure it'll hold full weight?" "Has to hold," Doss replied, preparing the harness for evacuation number 19. No other choice available. What he didn't mention was his growing concern about the backup rope's load rating, his suspicion that it might fail under stresses that the primary rope had barely survived. But wounded soldiers couldn't evaluate engineering specifications, couldn't choose between probable rope failure and certain death during enemy attack. They depended on his judgment, his willingness to trust equipment beyond its design parameters, his stubborn conviction that faith could overcome mathematical impossibility. Private Henderson became the 19th man lowered from Hacksaw Ridge, unconscious from head wounds but stabilized enough to survive evacuation if handled carefully. As Doss guided him over the cliff edge, the secondary rope stretched more than expected, individual fibers elongating under load in ways that suggested marginal strength reserves. The descent took longer than previous evacuations, requiring careful speed control to prevent stress concentration that might cause sudden failure. But Henderson reached the aid station safely, and the rope held, proving that desperate improvisation could succeed despite questionable materials and deteriorating conditions. 19 wounded soldiers had been evacuated from the plateau using equipment never intended for repeated human rescue operations. 17 men remained, scattered across shell craters and collapsed bunkers, waiting for their turn at salvation through 60 feet of Manila hemp. The tactical situation was disintegrating as rapidly as the evacuation equipment. Radio intercepts indicated Japanese forces moving through concealed positions, coordinating assault preparations that would overwhelm American defenses within hours. Battalion orders demanded immediate withdrawal, abandonment of evacuation operations, preservation of unwounded personnel who could still contribute to the 77th Infantry Division's combat effectiveness on Okinawa. But Doss had stopped following battalion orders around evacuation number 12, when military pragmatism conflicted with moral conviction, and he chose to trust faith over tactics. 17 wounded soldiers remained alive on Hacksaw Ridge because he refused to accept mathematical impossibility, refused to abandon men who depended on his determination to overcome engineering limitations through prayer and stubborn persistence. As he prepared for evacuation number 20, examining the secondary rope's condition and testing anchor point integrity, Doss wondered how many more times the system would function before catastrophic failure became inevitable. Materials science suggested that repeated loading cycles weakened fiber strength, that stress concentration would eventually exceed rope capacity regardless of faith or determination. But 17 men waited in the darkness, calling medic from positions where Japanese assault would mean certain death. The rope might hold for 17 more evacuations, or it might snap during the very next one. Everything depended on Manila hemp, anchor points, and the conviction that moral necessity could overcome physical limitations through determination and prayer. The backup rope sang its own warning song as Doss tested it for the 20th evacuation, a higher-pitched vibration that suggested even greater stress concentration than the primary rope had exhibited before failure. But it was the only rope remaining, the only hope for getting 17 wounded soldiers off Hacksaw Ridge, before enemy forces emerged from their concealed positions and overran American defenses. Faith sometimes meant trusting equipment beyond its design limits, believing that determination could overcome engineering constraints, choosing to continue when mathematics counseled retreat. The secret that never appeared in any after-action report was how Doss's hands shook during evacuation number 23, so violently he could barely grip the rope that had become everything: lifeline, anchor point, connection between wounded soldiers and survival. The official citation would describe conspicuous gallantry and unwavering courage, but it wouldn't mention the moment when fear nearly overwhelmed Faith, when the mathematical impossibility of saving everyone almost broke his determination to keep trying. Private Nakamura was unconscious from massive blood loss, his breathing shallow and irregular, probably dying regardless of medical intervention. In any normal triage situation, he would be classified as expectant, expected to die, resources allocated to soldiers with better survival chances. But Hacksaw Ridge had moved beyond normal medical protocols hours ago, entering territory where every wounded soldier received equal effort regardless of injury, severity, or realistic prognosis. The secondary rope showed critical stress markers at the anchor point, individual fibers separating in ways that indicated imminent failure under continued loading. Doss had been monitoring the deterioration through 22 successful evacuations, watching Manila Hemp approach its breaking point while Japanese forces prepared for assault that would make further rescue operations impossible. Materials science suggested maybe 3 more evacuations before catastrophic breakdown. 13 wounded soldiers remained on the plateau. The moment of truth came as he prepared to lower Nakamura over the cliff edge, testing rope tension one final time before committing a dying man's weight to fibers that might snap at any instant. His hands trembled so severely he couldn't maintain steady grip, his body responding to stress and exhaustion that had accumulated through 18 hours of continuous evacuation operations under combat conditions. "Doc, you okay?" Sergeant Collins asked, noticing the tremor that Doss couldn't control. "Just tired," Doss replied, though it was more than fatigue. It was the crushing weight of responsibility for 13 lives that depended on his willingness to trust failing equipment and his own judgment about when faith became foolishness. The truth he never shared publicly was that he almost stopped at evacuation 23, almost accepted that mathematics had to govern moral choices, and 13 men would die because rope strength couldn't overcome physical limitations. For perhaps 30 seconds, kneeling beside Nakamura's unconscious form, with the fraying rope singing its warning song, he nearly chose tactical retreat over moral conviction. Then Nakamura's eyes opened briefly, focused on Doss's face with the kind of trust that wounded soldiers gave to medics. Absolute, unquestioning faith that help would come regardless of circumstances. It was a look that decided everything, that made continuing inevitable despite rope failure probability and approaching enemy assault. The descent with Nakamura was the longest 60 feet of Doss's life, every inch marked by rope vibration that suggested imminent catastrophic failure. He controlled speed carefully, distributing load to prevent stress concentration, listening for the sound of fibers parting that would mean both men falling to their deaths. But somehow the Manila Hemp held. Somehow materials science yielded to moral necessity, and Nakamura reached the aid station alive. 23 evacuations completed. 12 wounded soldiers remained on Hacksaw Ridge. What the citation couldn't capture was how each subsequent evacuation became an act of faith that transcended rational calculation. Doss knew the rope should have failed by evacuation 25, certainly by evacuation 27, inevitably by evacuation 30. Yet somehow it continued to bear weight, continued to lower wounded soldiers toward safety while Japanese forces moved into final assault positions. The 77th Infantry Division's withdrawal had been postponed twice to accommodate evacuation operations that violated every tactical principle, but succeeded through desperate improvisation and refusal to accept mathematical limitations. Battalion headquarters monitored radio communications from the plateau, tracking progress that seemed impossible under the circumstances, but continued methodically as if physics had suspended normal rules for one night on Okinawa. Dr. Harrison sent word from the aid station that all evacuated soldiers were receiving treatment, that field hospitals had reorganized entirely to handle the influx of casualties from Hacksaw Ridge. 33 wounded men had been lowered from the plateau using equipment never designed for such operations, saved by one medic's stubborn conviction that moral necessity could overcome engineering constraints through prayer and determination. But the personal cost was becoming visible in Doss's deteriorating physical condition. Hands raw from handling rough hemp, shoulders cramped from repetitive motion, legs shaking from exhaustion that went beyond normal fatigue. More troubling was the tremor in his voice when he spoke to wounded soldiers, the way prayer had become desperate pleading rather than confident faith. Evacuation number 35 was Corporal Williams, alert despite severe leg wounds, conscious enough to understand that he was trusting his life to a rope that should have failed 10 evacuations earlier. As Doss prepared the harness, Williams gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "Doc, how many more times you think that rope's gonna hold?" "One more time," Doss replied. "That's all I ever think about, just one more time." It was the phrase that had carried him through 35 evacuations, the prayer he whispered each time he lowered a wounded soldier over the cliff edge. "Lord, let it hold just one more time." Not 35 times, not all the way to the end, just once more for the man who needed help now. Williams made it down safely, bringing the total to 35 successful evacuations using a rope that material science said should have failed after 20. One wounded soldier remained on the plateau, Private Chen, barely conscious from multiple fragment wounds, weighing perhaps 160 pounds plus equipment. One more evacuation, one more test of Manila hemp that had already exceeded every engineering specification. The final descent would happen in complete darkness, with Japanese forces beginning preliminary movements that suggested assault was imminent. Everything depended on faith, in fiber strength, in anchor points, in the conviction that moral necessity could overcome physical limitations through prayer and stubborn determination. Private Chen was the 36th and final man lowered from Hacksaw Ridge, his weight disappearing into darkness at 2156 hours as Japanese forces emerged from concealed positions and began the assault that would reclaim the plateau within minutes. The rope held for one last evacuation. Manila hemp stretched beyond every engineering specification, but somehow maintaining integrity long enough to complete the impossible rescue operation that would become legend. As Chen's weight left the rope, Doss collapsed beside the anchor point, his hands finally releasing manila fibers that had become extensions of his own body through 18 hours of continuous evacuation operations. 36 wounded soldiers had been lowered to safety using equipment never designed for such stress, saved by one medic's refusal to accept mathematical limitations or abandon men who depended on his determination to overcome physical constraints through faith. The descent from Hacksaw Ridge came in stages, with Japanese forces advancing across the plateau as American defenders executed fighting withdrawal toward the cliff edge. Doss was among the last to leave, helping Sergeant Collins and Lieutenant Morrison destroy equipment that couldn't be evacuated, ensuring that nothing useful would fall into enemy hands. The rope itself was cut free and pulled down, 60 feet of frayed manila hemp that had saved 36 lives through desperate improvisation. The after-action report filed by battalion headquarters was clinical in its brevity. Combat medic successfully evacuated 36 wounded personnel from exposed position during tactical withdrawal. Evacuation operations conducted using improvised rope system under enemy fire. No casualties during evacuation phase. Recommend medic for appropriate recognition. The mathematics were simple, the outcome clear, but the report captured nothing of rope failure probability, trembling hands or whispered prayers that carried each wounded soldier safely down the cliff. Dr. Harrison debriefed Doss at the aid station, asking practical questions about evacuation procedures, rope strength, load distribution, technical details that might inform future rescue operations. But he noticed the tremor in the medic's hands, the way his voice shook when describing anchor point failures, the 1,000-yard stare that suggested psychological impact beyond normal combat stress. Saving 36 lives had exacted a price that wouldn't appear in medical records. "You did something impossible up there," Harrison said. "Rope should have failed after 20 evacuations, certainly after 30. What made the difference?" Doss looked at his hands, still marked by rope burns that would scar permanently. He thought about trying to explain faith to a doctor who dealt in medical probabilities, about describing prayer to someone trained in surgical procedures and pharmaceutical intervention. "Don't rightly know, Doc. Just kept asking for one more evacuation, one more man safe, one more chance for the rope to hold. Somehow it did." The 77th Infantry Division regrouped at positions below Hacksaw Ridge, reorganizing after tactical withdrawal that had preserved most personnel despite heavy casualties during the 3-day operation. Japanese forces reoccupied the plateau but gained no strategic advantage. American forces had accomplished their mission, cleared enemy positions, and evacuated all wounded personnel without abandoning anyone to capture or death. But for Doss, the personal aftermath proved more difficult than the evacuation operations themselves. Sleep brought dreams of rope failure, of wounded soldiers falling through darkness while he stood helpless at the cliff edge. The smell of manila hemp triggered vivid memories of each evacuation, each moment when faith overcame mathematics, each time the rope held when engineering specifications said it should snap. Years later, interviewed for historical records, Doss struggled to explain what had happened on Hacksaw Ridge, how 36 evacuations had been completed using equipment rated for perhaps 20. He spoke carefully about faith and determination, about refusing to abandon wounded comrades, about prayer that sustained him through impossible circumstances. But he rarely mentioned the trembling hands, the moments of doubt, the terrible weight of responsibility for lives that depended on his judgment and failing rope. The rope itself was never recovered from the base of Hacksaw Ridge, probably destroyed by subsequent combat operations or claimed by weather and time. But its legacy lived on in 36 men who survived wounds that should have been fatal, who returned home to families they might never have seen again without one medic's stubborn conviction that moral necessity could overcome physical limitations. The official citation would be upgraded twice, eventually becoming the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his own life above and beyond the call of duty. Odium, but Doss treasured more the letters from wounded soldiers, the quiet words from men who remembered being lowered through darkness on a rope that shouldn't have held, but somehow did. Sergeant Collins visited him years after the war, 2 men sharing coffee while rain drummed against windows and brought back memories of wet nights on Okinawa. They talked around the subject at first, discussing families and civilian jobs, avoiding the weight that both carried from their time on Hacksaw Ridge. "I still wonder about that rope," Collins finally said, "how it held for 36 men when it should have broken after 20. Never could figure the mathematics." Doss listened to rain against glass. remembering the sound of Manila hemp singing under stress, the feel of fibers stretching beyond their design limits, while wounded soldiers trusted their lives to his judgment about material strength and divine intervention. "Maybe mathematics isn't everything," he replied quietly. "Maybe some things hold together because they have to, because people depend on them, because faith matters more than engineering specifications." The legend would grow larger than the memory, citations and ceremonies expanding what happened on Hacksaw Ridge into something that sounded impossible even to those who lived it. But for Doss, the truth remained smaller and more personal. One fraying rope, 36 wounded soldiers, and the prayer repeated through 18 hours of darkness. "Lord, let it hold just one more time." Sometimes, impossibly, faith had been enough. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.